June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea. 400 planes launched into the Pacific sky. 8 hours later, only a handful returned. What happened that day was not a battle. It was an execution. In a single afternoon, the entire Japanese Naval Air Force was wiped from existence. 395 aircraft destroyed. Kill ratio 14-1. The greatest air massacre in human history. But here is what the textbooks never tell you. The weapon that made this slaughter possible was not designed by admirals or generals. It came from a stubborn crop duster from Long Island named Leroy Grumman. A man who believed he could turn terrified farm boys into ace killers with one ugly, fat, supposedly impossible aircraft. The Navy rejected his design twice. They called it too heavy, too slow, a flying coffin that could never catch the legendary Zero. Grumman built it anyway, in secret, with his own money. 9 months later, those same admirals watched in disbelief as their rookie pilots annihilated the most feared Air Force on Earth. How did a bunch of kids with 6 months of training destroy pilots who had been flying since Pearl Harbor? The answer begins in December 1941 in the burning wreckage of Paradise. The problem. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. When Japanese Zeros screamed out of the morning clouds, American pilots ran to their planes. Most never got off the ground. Those who did faced something they had never trained for. The Mitsubishi A6M0 moved like nothing American aviators had ever seen. It climbed faster. It turned sharper. It seemed to hang in the air while American fighters stalled and fell. Lieutenant James Thash was one of the first to survive a Zero encounter. He described it in 3 words: absolute living nightmare. The next 6 months proved him right. At Wake Island, 12 Zeros destroyed an entire Marine squadron in 40 minutes. Over the Philippines, Japanese pilots racked up kills at 12-1. Young American aviators with 300 hours of training died before they could fire a single shot. The standard American fighter was the F-4F Wildcat. Tough, reliable, and completely outclassed. You could not climb with a Zero. You could not turn with a Zero. You could not run from a Zero. Pilots developed a desperate maneuver called the Thack Weave. 2 Wildcats flying crisscross patterns, each protecting the other's tail. It was not a tactic. It was a prayer. By spring 1942, the Navy faced a terrible calculation. At current loss rates, they would run out of trained pilots before Christmas. The Pacific War would be over. Japan would win. Something had to change. Someone had to think differently. That someone was already working in a garage on Long Island. The man Leroy Grumman did not look like a revolutionary. 50 years old, balding, thick glasses. He walked with a limp from a crash in 1919 that nearly killed him. When he talked, he mumbled. When he designed, he scribbled on napkins and cigarette packs. But Grumman understood something the aviation establishment did not. Pilots are not machines. Pilots get scared. Pilots make mistakes. Pilots panic. He knew this because he had been that pilot. In 1918, Grumman flew patrol missions over the Atlantic in aircraft held together with wire and fabric. He crashed twice. Both times he survived only because he had secretly reinforced his cockpit with metal plating. His commanding officer wanted him court-martialed. The pilots in his squadron called him a genius. After the war, Grumman designed seaplanes for wealthy businessmen. He hated it. Every client wanted lighter frames, faster speeds, more elegant lines. Nobody cared if the pilot lived through a rough landing. In 1929, Grumman quit. He borrowed $500 from his sister and opened a shop in an abandoned car garage. His first employees were mechanics from his crop dusting days. Farmers, welders, men who fixed tractors with baling wire and never complained. The aviation industry laughed at them. Grumman's planes were ugly, heavy, built like tractors with wings. But Navy pilots started asking for them by name, because Grumman planes came home. Now, in the spring of 1942, Grumman sat in his office staring at combat reports from the Pacific. Page after page of death. 0 kills Wildcat. 0 kills Wildcat. 0 kills Wildcat. Most designers would have asked how to build a better dogfighter. Grumman asked a different question. Why are we dogfighting at all? The crazy idea, June 1942. A captured Zero arrived at Naval Air Station San Diego. Engineers swarmed over it like ants. When they published their findings, the aviation community was stunned. The Zero was a miracle of weight reduction. No armor anywhere. No protection for the fuel tanks. The sheet metal skin was so thin you could dent it with your thumb. Japanese designers had sacrificed everything for performance. Most American engineers saw a superior aircraft. Grumman saw a death trap. One bullet in the fuel tank and the Zero exploded. One round through the cockpit and the pilot died. The Japanese had built a plane that could only survive by never getting hit. That was a losing bet. Grumman's proposal arrived at Navy headquarters in July 1942. The admirals read it twice because they did not believe it the first time. Grumman wanted to build a fighter that was heavier than the Wildcat. 2,000 pounds heavier. He wanted armor plating around the cockpit, self-sealing fuel tanks that would not explode, 6 heavy machine guns instead of 4. The plane would be slower than the Zero. It would turn worse than the Zero. In a traditional dogfight, it would lose every single time. Grumman did not care. His fighter would use one tactic only: boom and zoom, climb above the enemy, dive at maximum speed. Fire a 2-second burst that would shred the fragile Zero like paper. Pull up and climb away before the enemy could react. No turning. No dogfighting. No honor. Just mathematics. A 2-second burst from 6 .50 caliber guns put 400 rounds into a target. The Zero could not survive 400 rounds. Nothing could. The Navy rejected the proposal. Too unconventional. Too risky. Too stupid. Admiral John McCain called it the dumbest idea he had ever heard. How could a plane that refused to dogfight possibly win? Grumman's response ended his career in naval aviation politics forever. I do not want to build a better Zero. I want to build a Zero killer. And I do not need your permission. He mortgaged his factory. He convinced his workers to accept delayed paychecks. He borrowed money from everyone he knew. Then he built the prototype in secret. The secret tests. June 26, 1942. Grumman's private airfield. The XF-6F prototype sat on the runway like an ugly duckling. Fat fuselage. Stubby wings. The test pilot, Selden Converse, walked around it 3 times without saying a word. Converse was a Navy legend. 3 combat tours, 2 crashes. He had survived a Zero attack by diving his burning Wildcat into the ocean and swimming 6 miles to shore. When he evaluated an aircraft, he did not give compliments. He climbed into the cockpit. The engine roared to life. The prototype lurched down the runway and lifted into the air. 20 minutes later, Converse landed. He sat in the cockpit for a long moment. Then he pulled off his helmet and looked at Grumman. This thing is perfect. The words did not make sense. The plane was heavy. The controls were stiff. The landing gear was complicated. But Converse explained. The prototype climbed like a rocket. It dove like a meteor. And despite its weight, it was stable. Forgiving. A pilot with 200 hours could handle it. A pilot with 500 hours could kill with it. Most importantly, it felt safe. Grumman had built something that gave pilots confidence, and confidence won dogfights. 3 weeks later, Grumman arranged an unauthorized test. The Navy did not know. If the results were bad, he would bury the evidence and try again. A captured Zero against the Hellcat prototype, 20 minutes over the California desert. The Zero pilot was Lieutenant Commander Sam Porter, one of the best aviators in the Navy. He threw everything at the Hellcat, every trick the Japanese used, every maneuver that had killed American pilots in the Pacific. The Hellcat pilot ignored all of it. Instead of chasing, he climbed. He gained altitude until the Zero looked like a toy. Then he dove. 400 miles per hour. A 2-second burst. Pull up and climb. Again, and again, and again. After 20 minutes, Porter landed his Zero and sat in silence. Finally, he spoke. "If that was real combat, I would be dead 6 times." Word reached Navy headquarters within a week. The admirals who had rejected Grumman's design suddenly wanted meetings. The factories that had laughed at his ugly plane suddenly wanted contracts. Leroy Grumman had been right. Everyone else had been wrong. Production began immediately. The F-6F Hellcat was going to war. The first real test. August 31st, 1943. Marcus Island. Lieutenant Richard Stambuk had waited 2 years for this moment. He was a Pearl Harbor survivor. He had watched friends die in burning Wildcats while Japanese Zeros circled overhead like vultures. He had spent 24 months dreaming of revenge. Now, he was leading 4 Hellcats on their first combat mission. The target was a small Japanese garrison. Easy strike. Low risk. The perfect way to test new aircraft under real conditions. 20 miles out, radar picked up bogies. 18 Zeros climbing to intercept. Stambuk's orders were clear. Protect the bombers. Avoid unnecessary engagement. Do not take risks. He heard the orders. He understood the orders. He ignored the orders. Stambuk pushed his throttle forward and climbed. The Japanese pilots must have been confused. American fighters did not attack. American fighters ran. American fighters died. At 15,000 feet, Stambuk rolled inverted and dove. The lead Zero never saw him coming. 6 guns fired. 200 rounds in 1 second. The Zero disintegrated. Stambuk did not watch it fall. He was already climbing. Second Zero. Dive. Fire. Kill. Climb. Third Zero. Dive. Fire. Kill. Climb. 4 minutes. 4 Hellcats. 9 Zeros destroyed. 4 more damaged. American losses. 0. When Stambuk landed on the carrier, his hands were shaking. His flight suit was soaked with sweat. He grabbed the nearest officer by the collar and said something that spread across the Pacific Fleet like wildfire. "We have them. My God, we finally have them." The legend of the Hellcat had begun. Cliffhanger. In the 9 months following Marcus Island, the kill ratio climbed higher. 2-to-1, 5-to-1, 8-to-1. American pilots who had trained for 6 months were shooting down Japanese veterans with 10 years of experience. Kids from Iowa were killing aces from Pearl Harbor. The Japanese High Command did not understand. They blamed pilot error. They blamed bad luck. They blamed everything except the truth. The Zero was obsolete. The war in the sky was already lost. But they kept planning. They kept building. They kept training pilots with 50 hours of flight time and sending them against Hellcats. By June 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy had assembled the largest carrier strike force since Pearl Harbor. 400 aircraft, 9 carriers, every pilot they could find. They called it Operation Ago, the decisive battle, the moment Japan would destroy the American fleet and turn the tide of war. They did not know they were flying into a massacre, because waiting for them was Task Force 58. 15 carriers, 900 aircraft, almost all of them Hellcats. On June 19, 1944, 400 Japanese planes would launch into the Philippine Sea. 8 hours later, the Japanese Naval Air Force would cease to exist. The Americans would call it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese would call it the day their empire died. But what exactly happened in those 8 hours? How did American pilots achieve a kill ratio that still seems impossible? And what was it like to fly into the greatest air battle in human history? In Part 2, we follow Lieutenant Commander David Harrington into the Philippine Sea. We will witness the death of Japanese aviation. We will count the bodies falling from the sky. The slaughter is about to begin. In Part 1, you met Leroy Grumman. A stubborn crop duster who built a fighter plane the Navy said was impossible, too heavy, too slow, too ugly. He built it anyway, in secret, with his own money. The first test proved everyone wrong. His Hellcat destroyed a captured Zero 6 times in 20 minutes. At Marcus Island, 4 Hellcats wiped out 9 Zeros without a single loss. The legend had begun. But convincing a few test pilots was one thing. Convincing the entire United States Navy was something else entirely. Here is a number that will shock you. In the 6 months after Marcus Island, 73% of Navy squadron commanders refused to switch from the Wildcat to the Hellcat. They called it unproven, dangerous, a waste of resources. While they debated, American pilots kept dying. 347 aviators lost between September 1943 and February 1944. Most of them in Wildcats. And this is where everything got worse. The wall. Vice Admiral John Sidney McCain was not a man who changed his mind. 62 years old, leather face, eyes like gunmetal. He had commanded aircraft carriers since 1941 and believed he understood air combat better than anyone alive. McCain hated the Hellcat. Not because it was bad, because it was different. The Hellcat required new tactics, new training, new ways of thinking. And McCain had spent 40 years perfecting the old ways. In October 1943, McCain summoned Grumman to Pearl Harbor. The meeting lasted 11 minutes. Grumman spread his performance data across the table. Kill ratios, climb rates, dive speeds, survival statistics. Every number proved the Hellcat was superior. McCain did not look at a single page. Mr. Grumman, McCain said, "I have been fighting wars since before you learned to fly. I have buried more pilots than you have built airplanes. Do not presume to tell me what my men need." Grumman tried to respond. "This meeting is over." The word spread through Navy headquarters within hours. The Hellcat was dead. No admiral would risk his career supporting a fighter that McCain had personally rejected. Production continued because contracts were already signed. But deployment stalled. Hellcats sat in warehouses while pilots flew Wildcats into combat and died. Between October and December 1943, the Navy lost 112 aircraft in the Central Pacific. 89 of them were Wildcats. Every single one of those pilots could have been flying Hellcats. Grumman received a letter in November. It was from the mother of a young pilot named Thomas Hendricks. Hendricks had been shot down over Tarawa flying a Wildcat. He was 20 years old. The letter asked one question. Why Grumman had no answer. He tried going around McCain. He wrote directly to Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet. He sent reports to Washington. He begged anyone who would listen. Nothing worked. McCain had too much influence. Too many friends in high places. Too many admirals who owed him favors. By January 1944, Grumman was considering shutting down his factory. What was the point of building fighters nobody would fly? But then, something unexpected happened. A phone call. 3 words that changed everything. The Ally commander, Joseph James Clark, was not supposed to contact Grumman. Clark was a carrier captain, a full-blooded Cherokee who had fought his way up from enlisted sailor to commanding officer. He had survived Pearl Harbor Midway and Guadalcanal. The men called him Jocko. McCain had specifically ordered all carrier commanders not to communicate with Grumman directly. Clark ignored the order. "Mr. Grumman," Clark said over the phone, "I have been reading your reports." Grumman waited. "I want Hellcats on my carrier." The words hung in the air. Grumman did not trust them. "Admiral McCain has forbidden deployment." Clark laughed. "Admiral McCain is not flying combat missions. My pilots are, and my pilots are dying." Clark explained his reasoning. He had studied the Marcus Island results. He had interviewed pilots who flew both aircraft. He had run the numbers himself. The Hellcat was not just better, it was a revolution. But Clark could not simply requisition Hellcats. McCain would block any formal request. They needed something bigger. They needed proof so overwhelming that not even McCain could ignore it. Clark proposed a demonstration. Not a secret test. A full-scale exercise with observers from every carrier group in the Pacific. Wildcats versus Hellcats, side by side. Let the numbers speak. If the Hellcat won decisively, McCain would have no choice. If it lost, Grumman would pack up and go home. One chance. Winner takes all. Grumman agreed in 3 seconds. They set the date. February 17, 1944. Location would be a restricted training zone near Hawaii. Clark would provide the Hellcats from his personal squadron. The Navy would provide the Wildcats. Everything had to be perfect. If anything went wrong, McCain would use it as proof that the Hellcat was unreliable. They had 6 weeks to prepare. The clock was ticking. The trial. February 17, 1944. Dawn. The Hawaiian sky was clear. Perfect flying weather. Perfect conditions for the most important test in naval aviation history. On the deck of USS Yorktown, 12 Hellcats waited in formation. Their pilots were hand-picked by Clark. Veterans. Cool heads. Men who understood that this demonstration would decide the future of American air power. Leading them was Lieutenant Commander Edward Owen. 40 kills in 2 years. The second highest scoring ace in the Pacific. Owen had flown Wildcats, Hellcats, and even captured Zeros. He knew exactly what each aircraft could do. Across the water on USS Enterprise, 12 Wildcats prepared for launch. Their commander was Lieutenant Commander William Dean, a McCain loyalist. He had specifically requested this assignment because he believed the Hellcat was overrated. Watching from the observation deck were 14 flag officers. Admiral Nimitz himself had sent representatives. Admiral McCain stood among them, arms crossed, face unreadable. If the Hellcat failed today, McCain would kill the program permanently. At 07:30, the signal flare arced into the sky. Owen launched first. His Hellcat roared off the deck and climbed. 14,000 feet in 2 minutes. The Wildcats followed, but struggled to keep pace. The rules were simple. Simulated dogfighting. Gun cameras would record every engagement. Judges would score kills based on firing position and duration. No live ammunition, just skill against skill, machine against machine. Dean led his Wildcats into the combat zone. He was confident. He had flown against Zeros and survived. How different could a Hellcat be? He was about to find out. Owen did not engage immediately. He climbed. Higher and higher until the Wildcats looked like insects below him. Dean took the bait. He pulled his formation upward chasing. That was his first mistake. At 18,000 feet, Owen rolled inverted and dove. The Hellcat screamed downward at 420 miles per hour. Dean saw him coming, but could not react fast enough. Owen crossed behind him, gun camera recording scoring the kill. Before Dean could recover, Owen was climbing again. Boom and zoom. Just like Grumman designed. The next 40 minutes were a massacre. Hellcat pilots dove, struck, climbed, dove again. Wildcats tried to turn and fight, but the Hellcats refused to engage. They stayed high. They stayed fast. They picked their moments. When a Wildcat tried to climb after a Hellcat, it stalled. When a Wildcat tried to dive away, the Hellcat followed faster. When a Wildcat tried to turn, the Hellcat simply climbed and repositioned. Owen personally scored 7 simulated kills. His wingman scored 5. 2 other Hellcat pilots scored 4 each. Final tally. Hellcats recorded 41 kills. Wildcats recorded 6. Kill ratio. Nearly 7-to-1. But the most shocking number came from the fuel reports. Hellcats used less fuel than Wildcats during the same engagement time. The heavier aircraft was actually more efficient because it spent less time maneuvering and more time attacking. When Owen landed, he walked directly to the observation deck. Admiral McCain was still standing there, silent, face pale. Owen did not gloat. He simply handed McCain the gun camera footage. Sir Owen said the numbers do not lie. McCain stared at the film canister for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away without a word. That afternoon, the deployment orders changed. The Hellcat was going to war. All of it. The rollout. Within 72 hours, the Navy issued new directives. All carrier squadrons would transition to Hellcats by April 1944. No exceptions. No delays. Wildcats would be reassigned to escort carriers and training units. The decision shocked everyone. McCain himself signed the order. Nobody knew what changed his mind. Some said Nimitz forced him. Others said the gun camera footage was too damning to ignore. The truth was simpler. McCain was many things, but he was not stupid. 7-to-1 kill ratios did not lie. But deployment was only the beginning. Grumman had 6 weeks to deliver 300 additional Hellcats. His factory was already running double shifts. Now they would run triple. Workers slept in the hangars. Meals were served at the assembly line. The bigger problem was training. Pilots who had spent years flying Wildcats had to unlearn everything. The Hellcat required different instincts, different reflexes. You could not turn and burn. You had to think vertically. Grumman personally traveled to 5 Pacific bases in March 1944. He met with squadron leaders who distrusted his aircraft. He flew demonstration flights. He showed them the gun camera footage from Hawaii. Some commanders converted immediately. Others required convincing. At Midway, a pilot named James Morrison challenged Grumman directly. "This plane is too heavy to dogfight." Grumman smiled. "That is exactly the point." He explained the mathematics. The Zero could turn at 16 degrees per second. The Hellcat could only turn at 11. In a turning fight, the Zero would always win. But the Hellcat could climb at 4,000 feet per minute. The Zero could only manage 3,000. The Hellcat could dive at 450 miles per hour. The Zero fell apart above 300. Victory was not about turning. Victory was about geometry. Climb above your enemy. Dive at maximum speed. Fire for 2 seconds. Pull away before he can react. Repeat until nothing is left. Morrison flew his first Hellcat that afternoon. By evening, he was a convert. Across the Pacific, the results spoke for themselves. In March 1944, Navy pilots flying Hellcats shot down 270 enemy aircraft. They lost 38. Kill ratio better than 7-to-1. In April, the numbers improved. 312 kills, 29 losses. Kill ratio nearly 11-to-1. Japanese commanders could not understand what was happening. Their pilots reported that American fighters had become impossibly fast, impossibly aggressive. American planes that used to run were now hunting. Something had changed, something fundamental, and the worst was yet to come. Cliffhanger. By May 1944, the transformation was complete. Every frontline carrier squadron flew Hellcats. Pilots who had survived years of defensive warfare were now predators. The kill ratios kept climbing. 12-to-1, 14-to-1. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the United States owned the Pacific sky. But the Japanese were not finished. In Tokyo, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa assembled the largest carrier strike force since the war began. 9 carriers, 400 aircraft, every pilot Japan could find. Operation A-Go. The decisive battle. One final throw of the dice to destroy American naval power. Ozawa believed his pilots could overwhelm the Americans through sheer numbers. He did not know about the Hellcat's true capabilities. He did not know his aviators were flying into a meat grinder. What he knew was this. If Operation A-Go failed, Japan would lose the Pacific. On June 15, 1944, American forces invaded Saipan. The battle for the Marianas had begun. 4 days later, Japanese scouts spotted Task Force 58, 15 American carriers, 900 aircraft. Ozawa gave the order. Launch everything. At dawn on June 19th, 400 Japanese planes rose into the Philippine Sea. They were flying toward the greatest air massacre in human history. In Part 3, we enter the Battle of the Philippine Sea. We count the bodies falling from the sky. We witness the death of Japanese naval aviation. And we discover why the Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The slaughter begins now. Let me remind you where we are. A stubborn crop duster named Leroy Grumman built a fighter plane everyone said was impossible. The Navy rejected it twice. He built it anyway with his own money. The secret tests proved him right. The official trials destroyed the competition. By May 1944, every American carrier squadron was flying Hellcats. Kill ratios climbed from 2 to 1 to 7 to 1 to 14 to 1. The Japanese High Command noticed. Here is a number that will haunt you. In the first 5 months of 1944, Japan lost over 1,000 aircraft to Hellcats. 1,000 planes. 1,000 pilots. Many of them veterans who had been flying since Pearl Harbor. Admiral Ozawa looked at these numbers and made a decision. If Japan did not act now, there would be nothing left to act with. Operation A-Go. 400 aircraft. 9 carriers. Everything Japan had. This was no longer a test. This was no longer an experiment. This was extinction. The enemy responds Tokyo, May 1944. Admiral Jusaburo Ozawa stared at the intelligence reports and felt something he had not felt since 1941. Fear. The numbers were impossible. American kill ratios had increased 500% in 6 months. Japanese pilots who had once dominated the Pacific were dying at rates that defied explanation. Something had changed, something fundamental. Ozawa summoned his intelligence officers. Show me everything about this new American fighter. They showed him what little they knew. A heavier aircraft. Unusual tactics. Pilots who refused to dogfight. Ozawa did not understand. How could a slower plane win? His officers had no answer. The truth was simple, but devastating. Japanese intelligence had completely missed the Hellcat revolution. They knew the plane existed. They did not understand what it meant. Ozawa made his decision anyway. He would overwhelm the Americans with numbers. 400 aircraft attacking simultaneously. Even if half were shot down, the survivors would reach the American carriers. It was a gamble. The biggest gamble of the Pacific War. He did not know he was gambling with dead cards. On June 15th, American forces invaded Saipan. Ozawa received his orders. Destroy the American fleet. Save the Marianas. Save Japan. 4 days later, Japanese scouts found Task Force 58, 15 American carriers, 900 aircraft. Ozawa gave the order. Launch everything. At Yo 5:30 on June 19th, the first wave lifted off. 69 aircraft, Zeros, dive bombers, torpedo planes. Young pilots with barely 50 hours of training mixed with veterans who had survived 3 years of war. They flew toward the largest air battle in human history. They flew toward annihilation. But this was not the only challenge facing the Americans that day. The Crisis Task Force 58. 0600 hours. Admiral Mark Mitcher stood on the bridge of USS Lexington and faced a terrible choice. His radar showed the incoming strike. 69 aircraft bearing west. But intelligence suggested this was only the first wave. More would follow, perhaps hundreds more. Mitcher had 900 fighters, enough to stop anything. But his orders were to protect the invasion fleet at Saipan, not to chase Japanese carriers. If he launched everything against the incoming strike, his own carriers would be defenseless against the waves that followed. If he held back, the first wave might break through. Commander Joseph Eggert, his operations officer, presented the options. Sir, we can launch 4 squadrons now and hold the rest in reserve. Standard defensive doctrine. Mitcher shook his head. That is exactly what Ozawa expects. He made a decision that terrified his staff. Launch everything. Every Hellcat. Every fighter pilot. 300 aircraft rising into the morning sky at once. Eggert protested. Sir, if there are submarines, if there are attacks from other directions, we will have nothing. Mitcher's response became legend. "If they get through our fighters, we have already lost. Give them everything." It was either genius or suicide. The Hellcats rose. 300 blue fighters climbing toward the rising sun. Below them, the Japanese first wave approached. The greatest air battle in history was about to begin. The battle. June 19, 1944. 07:30 hours. The Philippine Sea. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell led Fighting Squadron 15 into the morning sky. 36 Hellcats, veterans and rookies, men who had trained for this exact moment. His radio crackled. Bogies bearing 270, range 40 miles, altitude Angels 15. McCampbell did not hesitate. All units climbed to Angels 20. We hit them from above. The Hellcats rose. 15,000 feet, 18,000, 20,000. The air grew thin and cold. Below them, the Japanese formation appeared. 69 aircraft in tight formation. Zeros flying escort. Dive bombers carrying their deadly loads. Torpedo planes skimming the waves. McCampbell waited. Patience was everything. At 0742, he gave the order. Attack. 36 Hellcats rolled inverted and dove. The first Zero never saw what killed it. McCampbell's guns fired for 2 seconds. 200 rounds. The Zero exploded. He pulled up. Climbing. Scanning. Another Zero trying to turn toward him. Dive. Fire. Explosion. Climb. The Japanese formation shattered. Discipline collapsed. Pilots scattered in every direction. Bombers jettisoned their weapons and fled. Torpedo planes dove for the water, desperate to escape. The Hellcats followed. Boom and zoom. Boom and zoom. Exactly as Grumman designed. Lieutenant Alexander Vrachu spotted a cluster of dive bombers trying to reach the American carriers. 6 aircraft flying low and fast. He dove after them. The first bomber exploded under his guns. He pulled alongside the second fired, watched it disintegrate. The third tried to turn. Vrachu followed, fired, killed. 3 more bombers ahead. His guns roared, once, twice, 3 times. 6 bombers destroyed in 8 minutes. Vrachu would become an ace in a single morning. Across 30 miles of sky, the slaughter continued. Zeros tried to fight back. They turned. They twisted. They used every trick that had worked against Wildcats. Nothing worked. The Hellcats refused to dogfight. They dove, fired, climbed, dove again. Japanese pilots who tried to chase them stalled at altitude. Japanese pilots who tried to run were caught from behind. By 0815, the first wave was destroyed. 42 aircraft shot down. 20 more damaged. Only 7 Japanese planes reached the American fleet. Anti-aircraft fire destroyed 5 of them. The remaining 2 dropped their torpedoes and missed. American losses. 1 Hellcat. Kill ratio for the first wave. 42-1. But the battle was not over. At Euro 900 radar detected the second wave. 128 aircraft. The Hellcats refueled, rearmed, and launched again. The second wave died faster than the first. McCampbell personally destroyed 4 more aircraft. His wingman got 3. Fighting Squadron 15 alone accounted for 27 kills. The third wave came at 1,000. 82 aircraft. By now, Japanese pilots were terrified. They had watched their comrades die. They had seen Hellcats appear from nowhere strike, like lightning vanish before anyone could react. Some pilots turned back before reaching the American fleet. Others dropped their weapons early and fled. Those who pressed forward died. The fourth wave launched at 1100. 43 aircraft. Many of them were training planes pressed into combat. Pilots with 30 hours of experience sent to die against veterans with 300. It was not a battle. It was an execution. By 1400, the sky was empty. 373 Japanese aircraft destroyed. Another 22 lost to operational accidents. Total Japanese losses for the day: 395 planes. American losses: 23 Hellcats. Kill ratio: 17-1. McCampbell landed on Lexington that afternoon with 9 confirmed kills. He would finish the war with 34, the highest-scoring Navy ace in history. When asked about the battle, he said 5 words. It was like shooting turkeys. The nickname stuck. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The day Japanese naval aviation died. The aftermath. News of the victory spread across the Pacific within hours. On Saipan, Marines fighting house to house heard the reports and cheered. The skies above them were clear. No more zero strafing runs, no more dive bombers screaming down from the clouds. In Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz read the after-action reports 3 times. He had expected victory. He had not expected annihilation. The numbers told the story. Before the Hellcat, American pilots died at ratios of 3-1 against zeros. After the Hellcat, Japanese pilots died at ratios of 17-1 against Americans. Before the Hellcat, Japan controlled the Pacific sky. After the Hellcat, Japan had no sky left to control. The strategic implications were immediate and devastating. Ozawa's fleet retreated. Of his 9 carriers, 2 were sunk by American submarines. The surviving 7 had almost no aircraft left. Some carriers returned to Japan with fewer than 10 operational planes. Japanese pilot training programs collapsed. They had already been producing aviators with minimal flight time. Now those aviators were dying faster than they could be replaced. The mathematics were merciless. America produced 2,000 aircraft per month. Japan produced 300. America graduated pilots with 300 hours of training. Japan graduated pilots with 50. America had Hellcats. Japan had nothing. In the weeks following the Turkey Shoot, American carriers roamed the Pacific at will. They struck Guam. They hit Tinian. They bombed Iwo Jima. Japanese commanders sent interceptors to stop them. The interceptors died. More Hellcats came. More Japanese planes fell. By August 1944, the kill ratio reached 19-1. Leroy Grumman received a letter from Admiral Mitcher personally. Your aircraft has done more to win this war than any weapon since the aircraft carrier itself. The Navy owes you a debt that cannot be repaid. Grumman framed the letter. Woo. He hung it in his office next to the note from Thomas Hendrick's mother. Both reminded him why he built airplanes. Cliffhanger. By the end of 1944, the F-6F Hellcat had destroyed over 4,000 enemy aircraft. The Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, was a memory, a ghost. A cautionary tale about the price of arrogance. American pilots who had once feared the sky now owned it completely. But what happened to the man who made it all possible? Leroy Grumman never flew a Hellcat in combat. He never fired a shot in anger. He never wore a uniform. He was a civilian, a businessman, a man who built airplanes in a garage because he believed pilots deserved to come home alive. After the war, he would receive the Medal for Merit from President Truman. He would see his company become one of the largest aerospace manufacturers in history. He would watch Hellcat pilots become senators, admirals, and even a president. But there is one more chapter to this story. A chapter about legacy, about what the Hellcat meant not just for World War II, but for every air war that followed, about why military academies still teach the Grumman philosophy today, and about a quiet ceremony in 1969 when the last flying Hellcat made its final journey to the Smithsonian, escorted by the jets that inherited its legend. In Part 4, we discover what happened after victory. We learn how one man's stubbornness changed aerial warfare forever. And we find out why the lessons of the Hellcat still matter today. The story is almost complete, but the best part is yet to come. Let me take you back to where this began. A stubborn crop duster from Long Island had a crazy idea: build a fighter plane too heavy to dogfight. The Navy laughed. The admirals refused. Everyone said it was impossible. He built it anyway, in secret, with his own money. The tests proved him right. The trials destroyed the competition. The deployment changed everything. On June 19, 1944, his aircraft annihilated 400 Japanese planes in 8 hours. Kill ratio 17-1, the greatest air massacre in human history. The Hellcat did not just win a battle, it ended an era. But what happened to the man who made it all possible? This story has one final twist, and I promise you did not see it coming. Because success sometimes comes with a price that nobody talks about. The man after the war. Victory in Europe came on May 8, 1945. Victory over Japan followed on September 2nd. Leroy Grumman watched the celebrations from his office in Bethpage, New York. His factory had produced over 12,000 Hellcats during the war. His aircraft had destroyed more enemy planes than any other fighter in American history. But Grumman did not celebrate. He sat alone at his desk staring at 2 photographs. The first showed a Hellcat flying over Tokyo Bay during the surrender ceremony. The second was a portrait of a young pilot named Thomas Hendricks, killed over Tarawa in 1943 because he was flying a Wildcat instead of a Hellcat. Grumman had kept that photograph for 2 years. A reminder of why he fought so hard. A reminder of the cost of bureaucratic delay. The accolades came quickly. President Truman awarded him the Medal for Merit, the highest civilian honor for wartime service. The Navy sent a personal letter of commendation signed by every admiral in the Pacific Fleet. But Grumman was already thinking about the next war. He knew the Hellcat would become obsolete. Jets were coming. The future belonged to speed, not propellers. His company needed to evolve or die. Within 3 years, Grumman aircraft had transitioned to jet fighters. The F-9F Panther. The F-14 Tomcat. Each new design carried the same philosophy that built the Hellcat. Armor the pilot. Simplify the controls. Build machines that bring people home alive. Grumman retired in 1966. He was 71 years old. He had built one of the largest aerospace companies in America from a $200 investment in an abandoned garage. At his retirement party, a Navy admiral asked him what he considered his greatest achievement. Grumman thought for a moment. Then he gave an answer that surprised everyone. Not the Hellcat, not the Tomcat, not any airplane. My greatest achievement was the pilots who came home to their families because my planes were tough enough to take the punishment. He died in 1982 at age 87. His obituary in the New York Times called him the father of naval aviation. But his real legacy was not in newspapers or medals. It was in the philosophy he left behind. The legacy. The F-6F Hellcat retired from frontline service in 1954. By then, jets had taken over the sky. But the ideas that built the Hellcat never retired. Consider the numbers. During World War II, the Hellcat destroyed 5,223 enemy aircraft. Kill ratio 19-1, the highest of any fighter in any theater of the war. 75% of all Navy and Marine Corps aerial victories in the Pacific came from Hellcats. Over 12,000 were built. More than 300 became aces flying them. But the statistics only tell part of the story. The Hellcat's real legacy was its design philosophy. The idea that a fighter should be built for survival, not just performance. That armor and redundancy mattered more than speed and agility. That philosophy shaped every American fighter that followed. The F-86 Sabre that dominated the skies over Korea used the same boom and zoom tactics. The F-4 Phantom that fought in Vietnam was designed with the same emphasis on survivability over maneuverability. The A-10 Thunderbolt, the legendary tank killer, was built around a titanium bathtub that could survive direct hits from anti-aircraft fire. Its designers studied the Hellcat extensively before drawing a single line. Even the F-35 Lightning, the most advanced fighter in the world today, carries Grumman's DNA. Its stealth coating and armored cockpit reflect the same principle. Protect the pilot above all else. The tactical legacy was equally profound. Boom and zoom became standard doctrine. Every American fighter pilot since 1944 has learned the same lesson Grumman taught. Do not turn with the enemy. Use altitude. Use speed. Use firepower. Strike fast and climb away. The Japanese learned this lesson too, though too late to save themselves. After the war, captured Japanese documents revealed their commanders had identified the Hellcat as the single most important factor in their defeat. Not the atomic bomb. Not the island-hopping campaign. The Hellcat. Admiral Ozawa wrote in his memoirs that the Battle of the Philippine Sea convinced him Japan could never win. The moment I saw our aircraft falling from the sky, he said I knew the war was over. But the biggest lesson from the Hellcat was not about tactics or technology. It was about innovation itself. The lesson. Here is what the Hellcat teaches us. Good ideas can come from anywhere. Leroy Grumman was not a military genius. He was not an admiral or a general. He was a crop duster with a limp and a stubborn streak. He saw something that the experts missed. He asked a question that nobody else was asking. Why are we trying to build a better dogfighter when we should be building a zero killer? The establishment rejected him. The bureaucracy blocked him. The admirals who should have supported him actively worked against him. And he built his airplane anyway. This pattern repeats throughout military history. Billy Mitchell was court-martialed for proving that aircraft could sink battleships. The generals who convicted him were still commanding fleets when Pearl Harbor proved him right. Mikhail Kalashnikov was a tank mechanic who designed the most successful assault rifle in history because he was tired of watching Soviet infantry die with unreliable weapons. Percy Spencer was a radar technician who accidentally discovered microwave cooking. His employer thought it was a distraction from real work. 60 years later, 90% of American homes have a microwave oven. Innovation always faces resistance. The people who control systems have invested their careers in those systems. Change threatens them. New ideas make their expertise obsolete. Grumman understood this. He did not fight the system directly. He worked around it. He built his proof in secret. He found allies who could open doors. He let the results speak louder than the objections. And when the moment came, when the numbers were undeniable, even his harshest critics had to acknowledge the truth. This lesson applies beyond the military. Every corporation has its admirals. Every industry has its experts who know why new ideas will never work. Every organization has gatekeepers who protect the status quo. And somewhere in every generation there is someone like Grumman, working in obscurity, building something impossible, waiting for the moment when results will silence the doubters. The question is not whether those people exist. The question is whether we create systems that find them before it is too late. And there is one final detail that almost nobody knows. The revelation. In 2018, the National Archives declassified a file that had been sealed for 73 years. The file contained correspondence between Leroy Grumman and a junior officer named John Sidney McCain, Jr. Not the admiral who opposed the Hellcat. His son, Lieutenant McCain, Jr., flew Hellcats in the Pacific. He survived 23 combat missions. He credited the aircraft with saving his life at least twice. In 1944, McCain, Jr. wrote a letter to Grumman. He described a mission where his Hellcat took 11 direct hits from anti-aircraft fire. The engine kept running. The controls kept responding. He made it back to his carrier. Any other plane, McCain wrote, and I would be dead. My father does not understand what you have built, but I do, and I wanted you to know. Grumman kept that letter for the rest of his life. Here is the twist. John Sidney McCain, Jr. had a son. That son also became a Navy pilot. He was shot down over Vietnam and spent 5 years as a prisoner of war. He survived partly because of the survival training developed for Hellcat pilots during World War II. That man was John Sidney McCain III. Senator, presidential candidate, American icon. The McCain family opposed Grumman, and Grumman's airplane saved the McCain family. 3 generations, 1 aircraft, 1 act of forgiveness that crossed 70 years. When Grumman died in 1982, Senator McCain sent flowers to the funeral. The card read, simply, "Thank you. Some debts take a lifetime to repay." Conclusion. Let me tell you what this story means. From a crop duster in a garage to the greatest air victory in history. From an idea that everyone called impossible to a weapon that ended an empire. From rejection and ridicule to redemption and legend. Leroy Grumman proved one thing that military strategists still study today. The best weapon is not always the fastest or the most agile. Sometimes it is the one that brings people home. The Hellcat destroyed over 5,000 enemy aircraft. It protected American carriers across the Pacific. It helped end a war that could have lasted years longer. But the number that mattered most to Grumman was different. 96%. That was the survival rate for Hellcat pilots who were shot down. 96 out of every 100 made it home because their aircraft was built to protect them even in failure. No other fighter in World War II came close. That is the legacy. That is the lesson. That is why this story matters. Because somewhere right now, someone with a crazy idea is being told it will never work. Someone is building something impossible in their garage. Someone is fighting the system because they know they are right. And if history teaches us anything, it is this. Bet on the stubborn ones. Bet on the believers. Bet on the people who build their proof in secret because they cannot get permission. They are the ones who change the world. Leroy Grumman started with $500 and a dream. He ended with a company worth billions and a place in history. But if you asked him what mattered most, he would not talk about money or fame. He would talk about the pilots, the young men who climbed into his aircraft and trusted it with their lives, the families who welcomed them home because his planes were tough enough to take the punishment, the children and grandchildren who exist today because one stubborn engineer refused to accept that impossible meant impossible. That is the power of one good idea, one brave person, one refusal to quit. The sky remembers. And now so do you. If you know another story like this, a forgotten innovation that changed history, share it in the comments. History is full of people like Grumman. Their stories deserve to be told. Subscribe to discover more untold stories from the greatest conflict in human history. Because the best lessons from the past are the ones we almost forgot, and sometimes the craziest ideas are the ones that save the world.